In the last 14 videos, you learned how to code the select statement to retrieve and summarize data. Now, you'll learn how to code the insert, update, and delete statements to modify the data in a table. When we are done covering this topic, you will know how to code the 4 statements that are used every day by professional SQL programmers. Before we talk about the insert, update, and delete statements, you need to learn how to use these statements the proper way that won't affect live data in a company production environment. To do this, you can create test tables that are derived from the tables in a database. Then you can experiment all you want with the test tables and delete them when you're done. These are known as temporary tables, temp tables. There are quite a few different ways to create test tables, but we are only going to cover one way for now, and we will get back to the other ways in a later video. In this video, we are going to use the select into statement to create a temp table. When using the select into statement, the result set that gets defined by the SQL statement is simply copied into another table. That's a temp table. Now keep in mind, when you use this technique to create temp tables, only the column definitions and data are copied, which means that definitions like the primary keys and the foreign keys are not copied unless you specify them as a column. So the first temp table I'm going to create is an invoice copy of my invoices table. So I'm going to select all, into invoice copy, and then that's going to come from invoices. And then I'm going to run this query, and then you see here in my message down at the bottom 114 rows affected, which means there is a total of 114 rows that lived in the invoices table, and it was copied over into invoice copy. So now what I can do, if I wanted to select into my invoice copy, I can select all from invoice copy, and then you'll see the result set that was taken from the invoices table that was stored in the invoice copy, and it is being displayed here. Now let's say I only wanted to store a partial amount of data from a table into a temp table, and I want to perform like a calculation in my where clause. Well, let's select all into invoices copy 2. We can't use the same name because we already have the temp table that exists up here in our select window or in our query window. So it's, as long as our query window is open now that this temp table has been created, it is treated as an entity, and we cannot refer to it again. We would have to create a new name for another temp table. So I'm going to call this one invoice copy 2, and then this is going to come from the invoices table. Then I'm going to say where invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total is equal to 0. So where invoice total minus payment total minus the credit total is equal to 0, store that result set in invoice copy 2. So I'm going to run this query. I have 103 rows affected that were copied over, and then I can select all from my invoices copy 2. And here's my result set, and this is only displaying data where the invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total is equal to 0. Now let's take a look at a statement that creates a table that has an aggregate function to get the sum and to provide us with a summary row. So I'll select my vendor ID, and then I want to get the sum of the invoice total. I'm going to name that sum of invoices, and then I'm going to drop that into a vendor balances temp table, and then that's going to come from the invoices table. And then I'm going to say where the invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total is not equal to 0. That's what I want to drop in there. And then I'm going to group these by the vendor ID. And then I'm going to run this. We've got 7 rows affected. That's going to be our result set. And then I can go ahead and select all from my vendor balances temp table to see my result set. And you see here's our vendor ID, and then here's our sum of the invoices total. You can also join temp tables if they have the same key relationship. Like if I were to pull the vendor ID out of my invoices table up here at the top, then I'd be able to join my vendor balances and my invoices copy to temp tables together to create another result set. So quite a few things you can do here with temp tables, and it's very, very, dynamic, and you can accomplish a lot of things using them. Now, one more thing we're going to look at is how to delete our temp tables after we don't want them anymore. What if we're done with invoices copy to and vendor balances, and we want to drop them out of the session? Well, we could say drop table invoices copy to and run that query, and then invoice copy to has been dropped, and then we could even change that. We want to get rid of vendor balances. You can drop vendor balances, and then what's our other one? Invoice copy. You can drop that one as well. And that is how you drop your temp tables. You could also use this same statement, drop table, to drop an actual table in your database, but of course that is not recommended to do if it's a production environment for a company, or if that table contains information that is deemed very important to you. So you might want to make sure you do a backup of that data if you plan on dropping any tables in any databases that you have. So now we are going to learn how to use the insert statement. This statement allows you to add new rows to a table by inserting a single row or multiple rows. To begin using the insert statement, you must name the table that you will be inserting a new row into. And this is done by using insert into clause. When using the insert statement, you can insert rows without specifying a list of columns, or while specifying a list of columns. But if you do include a column list, you must specify the column values in the same order as they appear in the column list. However, you can't exclude columns with default values and columns that accept no values, and you must exclude identity columns. And that is mandatory. You must exclude identity columns. I know we didn't go over default values or identity columns in depth yet, but we will be covering that in a later video. So this is just to be aware of what can be done using the insert statement. So now afterwards, after you choose to exclude or include a column list, you code the values clause to list the values to be used for each column. So let's take a look at some examples. So first, I'm going to add a new row using the insert into clause, an insert statement that's going to add a new row, and I'm not going to use a column list. So I'm going to say insert into, and then I'm going to insert into my temp table here. It's going to be invoice copy. And before we insert in here, let me just make sure I create it here since I dropped it earlier. I'm going to go ahead and create it again. 114 rows affected. Now I can come back down here, and I should have my temp table here ready to go. And let me just select into it. Okay, now we know it exists. Okay, so I'm going to list the columns out. I'm going to insert first. I'm not going to list my columns. I'm going to go straight into values. And what I want is, first I'm going to say 97, because I know I'm inserting a vendor ID. That's the first record here in this table, and that is the vendor ID. So I'm going to insert 97 in that, and then my invoice number, which is the next column here, is going to be 456789, and then I'm going to use the comma separator again, and then my next column is invoice date. So I'm going to insert 2016-04-01. Use the comma separator. The next one in line is the invoice total. And so I'm going to insert for my invoice total 8344.50. And then my next one is the payment total. I'm going to insert 0 for that. And then my next one is the credit total. So I'm just going to go ahead and insert 0 for that also. And I'm not going to want to put this around single quotes because this is not a character column that I'm inserting into. This is an integer. So I'm going to insert 0 for those two. And then my next one is my terms ID. I'm going to insert 1 for that. That's also an integer type column. And then my last two here, the invoice due date and the payment date. For this one, I'm going to do 2016 0430. And then I'm going to pass in null for my payment date. Then I'm going to run this statement. And you see one row has been affected. We just inserted a new record, a new row into our invoice copy table here. And so now what we could do is we can select into it to see if the data that we just inserted exists. So we can select all from our invoice copy. And we can say where vendor ID is equal to 97. And it looks like our record is in here with an invoice number of 456789 that we have here that we inserted. Invoice date 2016-0401. Our invoice total 8344.50 is here. And our payment total, credit totals are 0. Our terms ID is 1. And it took our invoice due date and our payment date of null. So looks like our insert into the copy table that we created by listing the values straight that we wanted to go into the table. It was able to take it and it assigned it with an invoice ID of 115, which is the primary key of the table that we copied, which was the invoices table up here at the top. And we got a new record, and it's in a temp table. It's not affecting our live production table. So this was a cool way for us to kind of play around with live data on a temporary basis that does not affect live data. Next, we're going to look at using the insert statement to add a new row using the column list. In this first example, we did not use a column list, so in this next one we are. So I'm going to do an insert into invoice copy, and then I'm going to specify my column list. So I'm going to open up parentheses in here, and the first column is the vendor ID. The next one is the invoice number. The next one is the invoice total, payment total, credit total, and terms ID, invoice date, invoice due date. This is all of them here. Now I'm going to pass in my values for the columns I just listed. So now we're going to say values, and then I'm going to open up another set of parentheses, and in here I have to follow the column list. So the first one I have to supply is a vendor ID, so I'm just going to say vendor ID is 100. The next one I have to supply is an invoice number, so I'm going to say 456985 this time. And then the next one I have to specify invoice total. I'm just going to say my invoice total is 7,000.50. And then the payment total, I'm gonna say 995. And then I'm gonna say 0 again for the credit total. And then for terms ID, I'm gonna give it a 2 this time. And then for my invoice due date, I'm going to say 2018 February 6th. And then for the payment date, I'm going to supply a date this time, and I'm going to say 2018 February 20th. And I'm going to run this insert, and now you see we have one row affected, and then I can select all from my invoice copy. Then I can say where vendor ID is equal to 100, and we should get the row that we just inserted. It looks like it got assigned an invoice ID of 116. Here's our vendor ID of 100. Here's our row 456985 invoice number with our invoice due date of February 6, 2018. The invoice total is 7,000. Our payment total, we put 995 in there, and then we passed in 0 for credit total and gave our terms ID a 2. So, as you can see, this is how you perform the insert statement by using a column list. This is specifying the columns that you want to insert into. Now, what we did was we inserted a record into every single column that did not have a foreign key or primary key. And what you can also do is, if you only want to insert, three columns, then those are the only 3 columns you include in your column list. And so that's another way you can use the insert statement. For those of you that were wondering why my temp table here is being flagged as invalid object name, well, that is because my drop table statement exists before the insert statements, and so SQL runs its query window in a sequence starting from the top to bottom. And so if this query would run, if I were to execute this entire query, then the drop table statement would come before these inserts, meaning this temp table would no longer exist, which is why these are being underlined. But if I remove this drop table statement, now you see the underlines go away, and it's identifying the temp table as being created. So that is all for this video. In our next video, we are going to talk about how to update and then delete data. So if you're interested in the next video, head on over to database-tutorials.com. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you did not like this video, you know exactly what you got to do. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you next time.